Welcome everyone. I'm U.S Attorney, and it is a privilege for me to introduce today's event. There is so much to be said on the topic at hand, keeping our streets safe, that, as you would hope, my introduction will be brief. I want to welcome our three panelists, and I think I will introduce them from left to right. That's mine, so I guess I should say from right to left. I'm not as experienced at this as some of us, nor did I do the high school drama that might have enabled me to avoid that mistake, quite apart from journalism experience. To my far left, to heck with you. To my far left, we have John Chisholm, who is the new district attorney for Milwaukee County. I don't know whether after a few months in office it still feels as though it's new, but by most standards I think that we would say that. Mr. Chisholm is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin Law School, but while I ordinarily do not pause to note undergraduate institutions, received his college degree from Marquette University. Apart from all that, even he is certainly a friend of Marquette Law School. Next to him is Steve Biskupic, who is and has been for a number of years the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Wisconsin. Mr. Biskupic is a Marquette lawyer. He is also a Marquette professor, for he has somehow found time over the past couple of years, including this semester, to teach a course at the law school. Next to him is J.B. Van Hollen, the new Attorney General of the state of Wisconsin, and among other things, a former United States Attorney for the Western District of Wisconsin. Mr. Van Hollen is also a graduate of the University of Wisconsin Law School, but I'm really glad that we buttonholed one another in advance, because I learned that, and I think I had known this at one point, his wife, Lynn Van Hollen, is a Marquette lawyer. So we're claiming all three of them by one means or another today, and believe me, those are more immediate connections than some of the tangential ones I claim from time to time. Today's is precisely the sort of discussion that we ought to have as the law school for this region. We have come to say that we want to provide reason after reason for lawyers, judges, other public servants, community leaders, academics, really every engaged citizen, reason after reason for them and you to come to Marquette Law School. We may have overdone it a little bit today, as we have provided reason after reason after reason for people to join us. This is so both because we have the three individuals whom I have already introduced, and because we have three events going on simultaneously. Over at the Alumni Memorial Union, we have a national gathering led by our Marquette Elders Advisor Journal concerning pressing issues in long-term care for the elderly and disabled. And on this very floor, we have an event with a prominent speaker hosted by our National Sports Law Institute. So when I duck out very soon to put an appearance in at those events, it will not be for want of interest in this event. In fact, I very much look forward to listening to the entire webcast later. So without more, let me hand it over to my colleague here at Marquette Law School, Mike Gousha, our distinguished fellow in law and public policy. Mike, you've done great things with us for the past couple of months, and thank you particularly for putting this program together.
Thanks, Dean Kearney, and thanks to all of you. Thanks to all of you for coming today. We appreciate your interest, and we also want to say a thank you in advance to these three gentlemen who agreed to be with us today to talk about a subject that's important to all of us. And I thought I would begin that discussion by asking a pretty straightforward question, and I'll ask each of these gentlemen to answer this briefly. I think we all would like to get an assessment from them of the crime situation in Milwaukee, in particular the violent crime situation. So I would ask each of you to describe the level of violence in the city of Milwaukee. How would you describe it? We'll begin with the Attorney General.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks all of you for having an interest in being here. I appreciate the opportunity. Obviously, it's a huge problem. We know from statistics that crime is a huge problem here, not necessarily in every category larger than it has been in past years. But a problem just the same. I think beyond statistics, however, it becomes a greater problem. And it's a greater problem because of the reputation that Milwaukee is garnering because of crime statistics. It becomes a problem because of the philosophy that even people have in Milwaukee about their situation. It's reached a point, I believe, where the tide has to turn. It's very unfortunate that in the course of the campaign trail, I had many people who encountered me saying, well, why are you talking about the violent crime problem in Milwaukee? That's beyond hope. Can't we just write it off? Well, it's horribly unfortunate that we actually have people, and these are very responsible, educated citizens in our society, that even think that way, not to mention legitimately holding that viewpoint. I point out to them very rapidly that with a crime problem far in excess of what Milwaukee has ever had, Rudy Giuliani in New York managed to use some innovative techniques and turn the tide and bring things around. Population is going down in the inner city, and I think that is a derivative of the crime problem as well as other things. And it's a beautiful city. It's the driving hub of the economy and probably even the social life in Wisconsin. And we have every reason to make sure that we do something about the problem and make sure we reverse the trends. I'm confident that with the people we have here on this panel and other people who are interested from a professional standpoint in the Milwaukee area and the state of Wisconsin, that we've really got an opportunity now to make a difference and make a change.
U.S. Attorney Biskupic, a brief assessment of the violent crime problem here?
It's on the uptick. If you go back a generation and you look at the statistics, violent crime continued to fall on a steady line, and particularly during the 90s and early 2000. And now the last few years it's starting to uptick. I think for people in Milwaukee, everything's relative. Where do you live and what's next door? If you have a drug house or a shooting next door, violent crime in your neighborhood couldn't be worse. If you're living in some of the nicer areas downtown or in some of the nicer neighborhoods, crime is more abstract. It's something you worry about if you drive through certain neighborhoods. So it is sort of relative. On the numbers alone, which have been studied in the last 10 years, it was falling. It's starting to uptick. The murder rate seems to be independent of those trends, particularly because of the proliferation of guns. I mean, if you go back, I see a lot of familiar faces in this room of people who have worked on criminal cases going back 20, 30 years. What people like that will say to you is, 2 generations ago, a bar fight where 2 guys punching each other. Then a generation ago, maybe one would pull out a knife or another would break a bottle. Now somebody pulls out a gun, and if they shoot straight, we have a murder. If they don't, you tack on, another one of our 600 shootings in which it could have been a homicide, but the person just couldn't shoot straight. So that's the biggest problem, is what was an argument 50 years ago of 2 people who would get in a fist fight now ends up being a shooting, and there are an awful lot of those that contribute to the murder rate in Milwaukee.
Milwaukee County DA John Chisholm, your assessment.
Thank you, Mike. Steve just hit the nail on the head right there. With over 800 people, 800 of our fellow citizens admitted to Milwaukee area hospitals last year for gunshot wounds. The fancy Latin term that you all know is res ipsa loquitur. It speaks for itself, and it truly does speak for itself, because it's all occurring in the same densely concentrated areas that the armed robberies are occurring, that the drugs are being sold, that the guns are being recovered from, that the shots are being fired. And we have real people living in those areas, and they are going to make decisions about their life and about their actions based on what they know, what they're growing up around, what they're seeing. And that's the cycle that we encounter in these densely populated areas where the violent crime occurs again and again. And the data drives our policies. We want to get in there and we want to do something different. We don't want to just keep recycling the same problem over and over again. So that's the fundamental question right there. How do you do that? There's different approaches. I hope we get a chance to talk about some of those approaches. But ultimately it comes down to rebuilding neighborhoods, actually developing a sense of community again, and developing a linkage where we're communicating with one another, not just with law enforcement, but with the people in the community on a daily basis, so we can identify the worst offenders and get them off. And what we know this deep in our bones as prosecutors, that it really is a small number of individuals that create a disproportionate number of the violent offenses. If you can identify them early and pull them off, you can have a very positive impact on a neighborhood. But then you're going to have to do something else. You're going to have to come into those neighborhoods with some long-term solutions, and that's what we need to talk about.
We're going to talk about initiatives and specifics. I brought with me an email that I received from a gentleman who lives in one of the neighborhoods that you were describing, where there are problems. And I just wanted to share a brief excerpt of this with you, because I think this captures some of the frustration, in fact, sadness of some people in this community. He sent this to me on Monday morning after a sort of troubling weekend, and he said he resides in the 2400 block of North Sherman Boulevard, lived there for probably 30 years, raised my 3 kids in that beautiful Tudor home. He says, last night, Sunday night, on 3 separate occasions, we heard gunshots. So near that it appeared the shooter was in the alley or certainly on North 44th Street. We called 911. Squad cars were deployed, the shooter not to be found. He said the sad thing about this is that the gunshots have now caused in one block, 2400 block of North Sherman, 4 families to move, or they are in the process of selling and moving. Last year, he describes in the summer months, regular occurrence to hear gunshots on North 44th Street between North Avenue and Rice Street. And then he says a neighbor's house next to mine on North Sherman Boulevard had a gunshot bullet embedded inside the interior wall. He said they have moved away. We exchanged emails, and what was clear to me is that he loves his neighborhood. He has no regrets about having lived there or raising his kids there. He wanted to raise his kids there, but he is frustrated and he doesn't know what to do. You talked about this during your campaign for Attorney General, that you were going to focus on violent crime in Milwaukee. What do you say to people like this who are frustrated, who are saddened by what has happened to their neighborhood? What offerings can you make to them?
Yeah, the thing that I've been reaching out and trying to do, and keep in mind, I didn't go to Marquette Law School largely because I'm not from this part of the state. I've spent more time in Milwaukee and Milwaukee area during the course of my campaign than I had the rest of my life combined, and I'm very, very free to admit to that. I don't necessarily understand the problems and the solutions, and I don't think everybody has to walk through the door knowing the problems to be able to help as part of the solution. And that's really the role that I'm hoping to play. I've reached out to the gentleman here and a bunch of other leaders and said that I think we need to work together, and they need to help tell me what the Department of Justice can help do to rectify the problem. I think it's very difficult from somebody from outside of the community who doesn't necessarily understand it to come in with all the answers. What I say to an individual like this is, can you help us? Because I don't believe the law enforcement leaders or the mayor or any of these other groups have all the answers either. I'm a true believer that people want to have an ownership interest back in their community like this person does. And these people are in the best position to tell us what some of the potential solutions are of anybody. And that's something that I did as U.S. Attorney in the western side of the state, admittedly in different environs than downtown Milwaukee, some small towns and some more major cities like Beloit and Janesville, is we reached out and we brought people from the community, people who truly understood the problems and had suggestions for potential solutions, and didn't just listen to them and move on for political points. We actually listened to them, brought them to the table, and we used our power and positions to make sure that we effectuated some of the changes that they brought to the table. That's what I want to try to do. As Attorney General, I want to try to play a role where I can bring more people to the table, and if I can effectuate change by using my position in Madison to advance funding for whatever we as a group agree is the place we need the most funding, or use the bully pulpit to advance our ideas to get public or political buy-in, that's really what I see our role to be.
Steve Biskupic, let me have you address this. Can you offer hope to people like this? You talk about an uptick in violent crime.
Right.
What can you say to someone like that?
Well, you know, let me say this. The Sherman Park neighborhood has those beautiful houses, but is the person living in that house who sent you that email any less deserving of law enforcement protection than the person at 27th and Brown? I mean, there's a lot of neighborhoods that people don't like to live in, that people have to live in, and they're deserving of protection, and they're deserving of efforts of law enforcement just as much as someone who lives in Story Park or Sherman Park or some of the other nice neighborhoods. What we've tried to do, I don't want to give false hope. I don't have to run for election, so I don't have to worry about saying, you got to do this, you got to do that. I mean, I don't mean to be facetious either. We've tried to study who is the most, who are the people that are engaging in those shootings. And the statistics tell us that that is usually someone who's got a prior record, usually a prior felony conviction, and that possession of the gun by itself is illegal. The person that is most likely to engage in a shooting is someone who has experienced in crime and has access to guns. And that mere possession is illegal as well, and that violates both state law and federal law. And that's how we've been trying to target. Because the deterrence itself, the public deterrence of long sentences of 20 years or 30 years or longer that people get in federal court, it isn't enough to deter a guy who's just out of jail. There's plenty of access to guns. And it is, as J.B. said, you can't just pull out one thing and say, okay, if we just get tougher on felons with guns, that'll solve it. Or if we just restrict the distribution of guns, that'll be it. Or if we just give more employment, that'll be it. All of these things contribute. I don't think there's anyone in law enforcement who wouldn't say that it's the total package. And you can emphasize different things, and that's what we're trying to do. On the federal side, we're the big hammer. You know, we have the big statutes, we have the big penalties, and we try to take our lead from the state and local authorities. John, who led the gun program for a number of years in the DA's office, funnels to us the most violent offenders who are caught with the gun in the shootings in the Sherman Park neighborhoods and get exposed to these federal sentences where these guys come over wide-eyed when they suddenly realize they're facing mandatory minimum penalties of 5, 10, 15, 20 years after, you know, being revolving through the system. So the federal government's role in terms of federal prosecutors is to provide the big hammer. But it would be stupid for me to sit here and say that's the answer, because it's not.
John Chisholm, what ideas do you have that might help address these concerns that were just expressed?
What you have to do is literally beg them to hang on. Hang on to your hopes, to your aspirations of living in a safe community, and stay where you are, because we're going to come there. It's not going to be all the time. It's not going to be 24 hours a day. But we're going to be there, and we're going to do that in a structured way. And I think that's the approach that we in law enforcement have to take to it, is we have to get involved directly, right at the ground level, at the neighborhood level. The first thing for the Sherman Park resident is to join the Sherman Park Neighborhood Association and to show up at a crime analysis meeting where he's going to spend time looking at the information itself, so that we let data start driving our strategy. Let's start talking to all the assets right at the ground level. And what are those assets? You got the city attorney that has the ability to close down drug houses and abate nuisance properties. You've got the Department of Corrections now in-house with us right at District Number 7, where Sherman Park's located. You've got a community prosecutor who's got the ability to identify, working closely with the police department and with the neighborhood groups, the most violent offenders in District Number 7. We now have the ATF working closely with the Gang Intelligence Division, a violent crime impact team right out of District Number 7. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to identify our worst offenders, we're going to pull them off, and then we're going to either prosecute them at the state or the federal level. But we're also going to work closely with our community groups, with our faith-based groups, with our businesses, and we're going to tell them, by, hey, working together, we can start rebuilding these neighborhoods. We'll pull off the bad actors as quickly as we can identify them. We'll do it the right way. We will do it the right way. Because look, if what we're talking about is calling in the National Guard and arresting everybody for everything, we're going to very quickly run into a circumstance where nobody trusts us, and they don't give us that key thing that we need to prevent crimes from happening, which is information. Steve and I can tell you 100 times how many people we've prosecuted for violent felony gun offenses, and you know what? Each one of those, in my view, and in my experience, and in the data that we've collected, is a homicide that didn't happen. It's a shooting that didn't happen, but it's also the dog that didn't bark. Our successes are never noted. What is certain in my mind is that we've had the fewest number of homicides in the last 5 years. In the last 5 years since we started Operation Ceasefire and Project Safe Neighborhoods, where we focused our energies and our efforts on the most violent offenders, we've actually had the fewest number of homicides total. We're starting to track the shootings, which I think is incredibly important. We have to push those down as well. But let's focus our resources on that, but then let's get smart about how we do it as well, and let's start pooling all the resources that are not necessarily law enforcement resources, so that we can build an infrastructure right at that ground level, so that when we leave, when we pull out, and the police presence isn't immediately there, that there's going to be something that remains, something that is more permanent. And that usually requires the faith-based community to be there, the business community to be there, neighborhood groups, watch blocks. Those are the longer-term solutions. Our schools are a huge issue that we have to talk about, and we're talking about a permanent presence once we alleviate the immediate problem.
Let me very quickly, yeah.
All right, thanks, Mike. I just want to say that ownership interest, something that he's talking about, that John's talking about, is vitally important. We need to make sure we can't have a law enforcement officer out there on the street for every individual that's out there watching everything they do. We need to make sure that citizens not be vigilantes, but take more of an ownership interest in reporting and cooperating with law enforcement. And I think whether through reality or whether through just their perspective, they don't believe that law enforcement is doing their job, and therefore they don't necessarily have the faith to step forward and play their part. And that's why we need to sit down. We need to come up with something new. We need to come up with ideas and change the way we do business. And District Attorney Chisholm's already undertaking to do that. And when we do that and people see that we're making a change, they're going to take more of an ownership interest and will hopefully have a positive snowballing effect versus the other way, which is the way it's been going.
John Chisholm mentioned this, and it's been dismissed pretty quickly, but Southside Alderman Bob Donovan has said on a couple of occasions, either we ought to have military police on the streets of Milwaukee this summer, or we should have the National Guard on the streets of Milwaukee this summer. Are there any circumstances under which something like that would be considered by law enforcement professionals such as yourselves? I'll ask, go right down the line. We'll start with J.B. Van Hollen.
Obviously, you're never going to say there's never circumstances where it's justified. It's been shown many times.
Aside from a
many
civil
places,
disturbance.
Yeah, where there are times where it's justified. I'm very hesitant to turn Milwaukee into a police state. I think that would be something that would be of great concern, and I don't think that that's something that necessarily would restore faith and ownership in the general public, which we so vitally need to do. That's something that perhaps would run the perception the wrong way. I can't imagine supporting such an undertaking except in the ultimate last resort.
Steve Biskupic.
Well, under federal law, it's illegal. I mean, you just can't bring the military into a neighborhood in Milwaukee. And, for those of you who are critics of the war, is it working to have military members in Iraq serve as policemen? They don't like it, and the people there don't like it. Policemen are trained to be policemen. Military are trained to be military. And when you start mixing them together, you create, a mixed message to the people that you're serving. The police are supposed to serve and protect. What do you do when you bring in the military? I assume it's made in good faith out of desperation of seeing the numbers, of seeing the violence, but I'd much rather have 250 more Milwaukee police officers than I would 250 Marines.
John Chisholm, real briefly on that.
Our citizens are not enemy combatants. The reality is that 99% of the citizens share the exact same goals that we share, and they want to live in a safe community. It's the 1% of individuals that habitually engage in criminal behavior, and we have the resources to deal with them. We can do it smarter. There's no question about that. We can change our processes and our procedures, and that's why having the three of us up here right now is significant. We do have a significant level of discretion on how we structure our processes, and we can change the way we do business to make it more tailored to the problems that face people directly in their neighborhoods, whether it's a violent crime problem or some other problem that you want to nip in the bud before it turns into a long-standing criminal problem. So the solutions are here already. We do have the resources to do it. We just have to bring those solutions to the front and work very closely together to make those a reality.
Steve Biskupic,
Here's another reason why I don't think it's properly attuned to the problem. I think all three of us would agree that if you had 100 violent acts in Milwaukee, shootings or burglaries that you are targeting, most of the time those 100 violent acts are committed by 10 people who are repeat offenders. It's not committed by 90 people doing it once. And that seems to be, if you want to bring the military in an occupation way, it would be under the assumption that you can't trust 100 people in a neighborhood instead of just 10. And the statistics tell us, the study tells us, and our personal experience tells us, the guys that we prosecute, the men and women who commit violent acts, federally bank robbers, these guys tend to rob. Once you rob one bank, you tend to do it again until you get caught. And that's the same thing with the people who shoot guns. They tend to keep doing it until they get caught. So it's, for 100 shootings, you don't have 100 different people. You got 10 different people. And bringing in the military targets the 100, not the 10.
Let me toss out another suggestion that seems to come up when people feel frustration, and that is the whole idea of concealed carry. During the campaign, I think you're a proponent of concealed carry. Would that be a good thing for the city of Milwaukee if criminals were out on the streets knowing that citizens might be armed?
Sure. I've always corrected people on the word proponent of concealed carry. Basically, my theory has not been that I believe more people need to be out there carrying concealed weapons. It's that for a whole bunch of reasons, the government shouldn't be interfering in the lives of law-abiding citizens, preventing them from carrying concealed weapons when there are no statistics to show that they are the problem. So I don't propose people should all be out there packing, but I don't believe the government should be restricting my right to do so, for instance. It has been shown that there is some general deterrence. There have been no statistics to completely bear out whether it works to reduce crime or not. I have never proposed concealed carry to be something as an assistance to law enforcement, and I wouldn't say that I would propose we have carrying of concealed weapons in Wisconsin for the purpose of what you read in Armed Citizen in the front of the NRA magazine. because we'll have less crime because of it. There is some anecdotal evidence, like I just referred to, where you can have less crime because of it, but I don't think that that's a reason to be a proponent of it, and I don't think it's really part of the equation for solving the problem we have.
Do you think it would make any difference in Milwaukee?
Personally, I believe there would probably be some slight difference, but it would be so small that it would be difficult to differentiate whether it made a difference or not. So I really don't think it's part of the law enforcement solution at all.
I want to ask Steve Biskupic about his area of expertise. He talked about some of what the federal government does, and last year you helped take down the Vice Lords First and Keefe gang. These are street gangs. But I think the sense that some of us have is that the violence we see out there is not always gang-related these days. It's about people having arguments, as we've discussed, that seem to boil over into the use of a weapon. Are there specific initiatives that can target that kind of behavior, or do we sort of just have to wait until it happens?
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. Gang-on-gang murders are down. I mean, they're not what's driving the murder rate. The bar fight at 2 a.m. that shows up in the paper a couple days later that is what's driving it. John has spent an awful lot of time studying the numbers, and I remember one year the numbers upticked on domestic violence that led to murders. And that's something that there was a federal solution for, because it's not just felons in possession of firearms that violates federal law that we can step in with the big thing. If you're under a domestic violence order and you possess a firearm, we can step in there as well. And we did uptick our cases, and we saw a little bit of a change. I think it's successful, but that is the type of targeting response that we're trying to do. I mean, we really have spent an awful lot of time studying the numbers. I mean, we've tried to be rational of what we're doing and where we're going with this instead of just gut reactions. But in the end, if you ask, what can the U.S. Attorney's Office or ATF and the FBI, what can federal authorities do about two guys in a bar at 3 o'clock in the morning or outside the bar after the bar is closed, and they get in an argument and one of them pulls out a gun that's being illegally possessed and shoots another? I have to say the federal government can do very, very little there.
I've been part of the Homicide Review Commission now for the last 2 years. The mandate from the Homicide Review Commission was to look at the circumstances surrounding every homicide, both from the victim's demographics and the offender's demographics, and try to figure out certain common patterns that occurred in Milwaukee related to homicides. One classic example would be in 2005 we saw a dramatic increase in tavern-related homicides, either an incident that started in the tavern, spilled outside, or actually occurred right inside the tavern. Anywhere between 15 and 20% of our homicides that year were co-located with a tavern. So what you can do in real terms is start doing directed patrols at different times and different patterns. Send a squad car to a specific tavern at a time where you could predict something might happen and have an officer walk through. It's amazing how that might just calm the things down right there. Create an incentive program for tavern owners, for example, instead of always dinging them when an incident occurs at their tavern. Give them an incentive to report something that's about to happen, and when you respond to it and their license comes up the next year, you give them credit for that. They may have had a couple bad incidents, but you're going to give them credit for doing something well, in addition to looking at their license for other reasons. So that's one of the things we did, and that had an immediate effect. We actually see a decrease. You can always question whether we pushed it one way or the other, but we saw a dramatic decrease in the following year in 2006 in tavern-related homicides. That's information-driven strategies, and again, I believe that you can have a dramatic impact on neighborhoods by applying strategies like this, but you have to be right down there. You have to put as many of your resources as possible right down to the ground level, and that's why I've committed. In the last couple of years, we've had 6 of our prosecutors co-located right at police district stations, and they try to lead this process. In addition to working closely with the police department, they work closely with the city attorney's office and all those other groups, that target team we call them, that work at that ground level. The idea is identify these patterns right at your neighborhood level. It may be gunfire, it may be shootings, it may be armed robberies, it could be something completely different. It could be graffiti. Whatever the problem is that's creating the impression of an unsafe neighborhood, come together with a game plan, execute that game plan, and then stand back and say it either worked or it didn't work. If it didn't work, try something else. If it's successful, reinforce it. It's the old Army strategy. You don't reinforce failure. But you have to acknowledge, you have to assess this stuff, you have to measure things in some way. And that's what we've been bad at in the past. we need to get better at that. And Attorney General spoke of the issue in New York and Chicago and what's going on in LA. Those are all data-driven strategies. They have comprehensive systems in place to record what's going on and then act on it in a very rational way. They move on it. And for example, if you're a precinct captain and there's an uptick in homicides in your precinct, I can believe you that just believe me, in New York or Chicago, they will be on that captain within minutes and looking for an explanation. And they'll get a response. And I think we have to adopt a similar strategy here. It can be done. It truly can be done. This is an approach that I think we should adopt, and certainly I'm restructuring our office along these lines.
One more question before we take questions from the audience. We've heard a lot over the years about the broken windows policing approach. That's the one out in New York City that is credited with the turnaround in that community. Have we, and I want this as your perspective as law enforcement professionals, have we been committed to that strategy for a long enough period of time to know whether or not it works? We don't, by my understanding, practice that today. There is that school of thought that when you stop people who are creating disorder in your community and put them in jail, the crime, by its very nature, falls, because those folks are not out on the streets committing heinous acts. Are we committed to that strategy? Have we given it enough chance? Are you a believer in it? Start with you.
Well, I'm a believer in it as far as it goes, but if you look at the broken windows theory, it usually works in conjunction with a number of other theories as well. In and of itself, it isn't the solution. You don't leave the homicidal maniacs out on the street and just take off the people who are producing graffiti. I don't think the broken windows theory has ever worked in and of itself, but it is part of a total equation. I think the biggest problem we have in this area really is that we have a lack of a comprehensive approach. I think in the past there have been knee-jerk, quick reactions to a problem that haven't been well thought out. Band-aid solutions, 50 cops for 50 days. Well, that doesn't really solve anything long-term unless you have a long-term strategy that those 50 law enforcement officers are going to help you advance for that limited period of time. And the strategy with broken windows usually involves a number of other things as well. It involves taking those low-end perpetrators off the streets for a limited period of time, citing them, other things that can be deterrents to them. But you've got to have the long-term strategy as well. Both of these gentlemen have referenced recidivists. They have referenced the fact that 10 people commit 100 of the most serious crimes. That's something we're not addressing very thoroughly. That's something we have to focus an awful lot more on, because for whatever reason we have a revolving door in the state courts. Part of the reason the federal courts and federal prosecutors' offices have become so popular is because when we find these worst recidivists, the people who are the worst problem in society, we believe in law enforcement. Those are the people who are hard to rehabilitate. We need to take them off the street for the longest periods of time possible to prevent further wrongdoing. And
do we need to build more prisons again? Is that what you're talking about?
That might be part of the solution. Unfortunately, we have some people who are showing that no matter what you do, they are not going to be rehabilitated. They're never going to be productive members of society, and they are always going to be detrimental to your society. We are doing nobody any good if we release those people because we don't have space in the prison system. So, that is not the solution any more than the broken windows theory is the solution, but I think you need to have a comprehensive solution to look at people on a more individual basis, and that's exactly what your district attorney has been doing since he's gotten into office.
John Chisholm and then Steve Biskupic, and then we'll go to questions from the audience.
The last issue is an important one. My goal would be actually to put fewer people in jail and fewer people in prison and have a reduction in violent crime, and that's actually what they saw in New York City. And that seems like it's inconsistent or it's incompatible, but I don't believe it is. And I don't believe it is if you do it the right way. And there is a component, just as J.B. indicated, of broken windows in everything. That's just, it shouldn't be considered a separate program. That's just good police work right there. That means that you're available to the community on a regular basis, and the people in the community start to know their police officers. And I would argue they should know their district attorneys, that they should know their city attorneys, they should know their aldermen, they should know their community group activists and leaders, people like Craig Roten at Harambe, or the Sherman Park people, or the folks at the Southside Organizing Committee. You have some tremendously committed community groups and organizations. You should be working closely with your faith-based groups. Why do you want to work with them? Because they're there. They're there. Their church is there. They're not going anywhere else. That's the That's the population that they service, that their mission is directed towards. Why should you be working closely with the business community? Because they're invested. I call them the second faith-based community. Their faith is that their investment is going to be secure in Milwaukee, and they want to invest further in Milwaukee and continue to raise their families here and contribute to the tax base. It's fundamental in our approach that we should start our problems, start analyzing our problems right at the ground level and come up with strategies to address those problems as quickly as we can. And that's why I believe strongly in a regionalized approach. I've now redirected my resources in the office, where I've actually created 5 regions for both the city and the county, and I've created general crime teams to deal with all the crime that comes in from those regions. A couple of reasons you want to do that, and there's a couple of risks to it as well that are fair and reasoned, and that is you want to have people talking to each other on a regular basis and identifying the problems and putting the right resources into those problems. And to do that in a systematic way requires that you deal with people on a regular basis. So that's why I've committed to that approach. There are risks to it. There certainly are risks to it. You could argue you're going to become too close to the police department. You're going to lose your objectivity. And you have to account for that. You have to make it perfectly clear what our respective roles are and evaluate those risks and create backstops for those risks. But it shouldn't prevent you from trying to do things differently. I argue that we cannot continue to do things the way we've done them in the past. It hasn't worked. We can't keep recycling the same problems. And if the solution is simply to throw more people in prison and then let them out again and not have a game plan for when they're going to get back out, we're going to deal with these issues all over again. So we got to get smart about this.
Steve Biskupic, I'll give you the final word on this subject.
Well, it works if you have enough cops to do it. I mean, broken windows is just a metaphor for a cop on the beat having the discretion to address his problems as he sees fit. But if you don't have enough cops to put them in a neighborhood that they can recognize and be familiar with and get to know the people, then it doesn't matter what you call it, it's not going to work.
Let's take some questions from the audience. Raise your hand. I've been told I need to repeat them because we don't have a microphone for you to talk into, so I'll do my best to repeat them out. Short questions that I can understand. That's the goal here. Yeah. We'll take that one right up at the top.
Yeah, all the panels talked about encouraging people in high-crime neighborhoods to become more involved. My question is, when we had Chief Haggerty here, I asked her the same question. How do you get people who aren't in high-crime neighborhoods to get involved? People who may seem to think, well, as long as it's happening on the southwest or the south side and it stays down there, it's not really my problem, especially in light of, I live up here on the east side, and you have some shootings up there. Is it going to take something like that where it has to spill over into your neighborhood before you can get those kind of people involved as well?
I'll try and condense that because in television that's what you do. So, but essentially, is how do you make sure that people in this community feel like it's a problem for all of us and not just for a particular neighborhood, that we all share in this? John Chisholm, since
there are a lot of people who have left the city of Milwaukee who absolutely love the city of Milwaukee and feel very strongly about it and want to be involved, but they don't know how to do it. That's really what it comes down to. They don't have that structure in place that they can actually participate in some way in the solution. And that's the same, I believe, as goes the city of Milwaukee, so will go the county, so will go the state. And so the reality is just what you described there. That's not going to become infrequent. The reality is crime will spill out, and it does spill out. It's taking place right now in outlying suburbs. It's certainly not at the same level, but I can recount any number of instances where criminal gang organizations, for example, have operated. April 19th, 2003, you had the 19th Street Latin Kings execute Kevin Hirschfield at the Speedway station on South Packard. Before we in a joint operation involving literally everybody from the local level, the state level, and the federal level, were able to scoop those individuals off. They'd killed 6 more people. That same group of individuals, that same organization, in a 2-year period, had killed 6 more people. That's a devastating effect that a small group of people can have on an entire community. So there's no question that people have to look on this in global terms. And if the solution is simply to flee Milwaukee and run like heck from Milwaukee, it will follow. It will come. So let's deal with it right now. Let's all come together, acknowledge the problems, put the right amount of resources into it, use those resources responsibly. There's a countervailing argument that a lot of those resources have been wasted, there's been fraud, And there's a legitimate counter-argument to be made that we should hold those people accountable. If you give them the money to do something with it. And I agree with that as well.
Let me take another couple questions. Let's go right here.
How much of the local law enforcement resources are being utilized for homeland security or national security, anti-terrorism, instead of draw down on your ability to hold local?
Again, this probably goes to Steve Biskupic. How much of your resources are being devoted to homeland security, and does that hurt your efforts to combat crime in Milwaukee, for instance?
I would say it doesn't hurt for this reason. There's no doubt there are resources that are devoted to Homeland Security that could otherwise be utilized. But the biggest thing that Homeland Security has provided for the state of Wisconsin is the Fusion Center, which is, what 9/11 taught law enforcement is you got to integrate more. You got to be talking more. You got to communicate more, not just in little mini task forces, but more intelligence based. And so as law enforcement responded to that, it came together for drug cases and gun cases and tracing. We talk about all the statistics that we do. This is the same kind of network that we put together after 9/11 on Homeland Security. The idea that there are, deputy sheriffs at the airport or, they could be on the streets, I don't think that's as significant. I mean, let me just give you a simple number. There are fewer than 100 FBI agents for this entire state, okay? Now, you can say, well, gee, if we only had 5 more FBI agents working on violent crime, that would help. Hey, I'd rather have 50 more Milwaukee police officers. So I don't think there has been a real drastic switch of federal resources to come to that conclusion, and I wouldn't agree with that.
Let me get a quick remark from Attorney General.
Yeah, having
Hollen.
served as U.S. Attorney and now as Attorney General, I will echo what Mr. Biskupic says and maybe even accentuate it a little bit. I think perhaps the resources we placed into Homeland Security have helped us with general criminal law enforcement because they have increased federal, state, local law enforcement coordination. Homeland Security funds have completely funded the Fusion Center or Intelligence Center that is within the purview of my Department of Justice. And even though it was funded for prevention and detection in Homeland Security and is very necessary for that, there's a lot of downtime, and probably 90% of those resources are therefore spent on law enforcement sharing information and taking bad guys off the streets where we otherwise didn't have the resources to do so. Plus, we don't have that many people we've taken off the street. We've got FBI resources working on Homeland Security, and there are other state and locals who participate, but the numbers aren't extraordinary in Wisconsin anyway.
All right, thank you. Let's more questions here. We'll go over here.
You mentioned how 20 years ago people were getting a fist fight. These days it's a gun. I think that there's an argument to be made that society would become more tolerant, and I don't think that's a good way of more violent crime. And there's an argument to be made that society itself has some of these problems. What is your feeling on that? How do you feel helpless? Is that something you feel is beyond your purview of your job? That no matter what you do, society is going down the wrong path. Nothing's going to help.
The question in a nutshell is there have been societal changes that we see more accepting perhaps of a culture of violence. Do you as law enforcement professionals sometimes feel helpless to curb what could be, or at least is perceived by some as a societal trend? Let's just go down the line here.
Yeah, no, I certainly see societal changes. If I had commented on an earlier question that the district attorney had, I would say that we have more of a selfish society than we've had historically. So when you get to the fact of people participating and helping law enforcement having more of that ownership interest, I think we have less of that all the time. I think more people are concerned about them and their exact surroundings. Would this person have been interested in violent crime till it came out to his neighborhood enough to do something about it? I'm not so certain maybe they individually would, but there are an awful lot of people who weren't concerned about society as a whole as much as they have been, I think, historically. It's not in my backyard is an unfortunate theory that's out there a little too prominent. But it doesn't make me feel helpless because we do have great opportunities to effectuate change. We do have great opportunities to make sure we educate the general public and bring them back into the fold. And I think it's our job as law enforcement leaders to show them that they have an interest and that they can have faith and confidence in us going forward, working with them to do something about it. So is there a problem? Yeah, I think there is. I don't think it's irreversible.
Steve Biskupic, feel like you're banging your head against the wall sometimes?
You know, everyone knows the old bookstore at the airport. One time I was in there waiting for a flight that got delayed, and there was this book about life in 1900. And the beginning part of the book was a minister complaining about the bicycle, that the bicycle was the downfall of humanity, that it allowed couples to go off without supervision, and it was, I mean, it's a little bit of like that. I don't mean to downplay gun violence because it's very serious, but there's always a temptation to say society's going to hell in a handbasket, and they thought it in 1900, they thought it in 1950, I think it in 2007. So I try to keep everything in perspective.
John Chisholm.
I think people are always horrified by the gun violence, and particularly, and we have to keep in mind these are real people, and we talk statistics all the time, but the reality is that when you're dealing with the victims of these crimes, it has a devastating impact on them, and I do think people care about that, particularly when they hear those stories. There's always going to be the story that grabs their attention and brings them into it. And there's countless examples, whether it's a young child being shot on a porch or whether it's a suburbanite being shot while filling up gas or whatever the case may be. It's those stories that bring people in and remind them that they are all connected. But I argue again that the challenge right now is not that people don't care, it's that they don't know how to reconnect again. They don't know how to connect in a very real way to show that they want to do something about that shooting that occurs in District Number 7 when they live in West Dallas or in South Milwaukee or in Wauwatosa. They care. They care about that, and certainly if it happens in their neighborhood, sometimes they have the means and the relationships to demonstrate that they care more. But if we structure it so that people have an opportunity to get involved again at the ground level, I think we can facilitate that level of communication. But I do think that people still deeply care about these issues.
I think Mr. Biskupic is an example of what you're talking about. The top federal law enforcement officer clearly not concerned with the scourge of cycling in society.
Like I said, I don't have to run for office.
Yeah, but I think there's been less turnover in AGs nationwide than there has been in U.S. attorneys. So.
I don't know what you're talking about.
More questions. Let me go down here.
What resources, if any, are being put towards juveniles to sort of prevent them from becoming these adult criminals that are responsible for the majority of crime?
Maybe a brief answer from John Chisholm on that.
Not enough, certainly. I mean, if gun violence is issue number one, then keeping our kids in school would be number two. And I think we have to start somewhere. I'm going to propose that we identify the schools with the highest truancy rate and the highest or the lowest immunization rates. The two go hand in hand. Why do I couple those two? Those are the only ones that we have a leverage on, quite frankly, in the statutes that we're allowed to do something about. So let's start somewhere. But you got to start by keeping kids in school, and we're going to have to start by making sure that they're being raised in violence-free families. Is a key issue. So it implicates domestic violence. It implicates so many other things.
U.S. Attorney Biskupic, do you have any thoughts about that? I mean, you see the people who are in gangs and where the life begins and all of that.
We really catch them on the back end. I mean, the federal laws don't provide for juveniles to come through except under really unique circumstances. So I'm going to defer to my AG colleague here.
Well, I see we really have, and the district attorney talked about it earlier, we really have two fronts here that we're fighting on. One is the immediacy of violent crime and what we're going to do about it to protect the current safety of people. One is the long-term solutions. My experience once again as a DA for 8 years, where I've actually worked with juvenile delinquency cases and CHIPS cases, is up northern Wisconsin. But I think you're going to have consistency there with everywhere around the state. Most of that comes from, the juvenile delinquency comes from societal problems. These aren't bad kids. These are kids who don't have a family life, they don't have parenting, they don't have direction. Those are more the long-term societal solutions that we have to look at in conjunction with the short-term law enforcement solutions that we're discussing here.
Let's take some more questions. We'll go right here.
What sort of influence do you have over the schools to change the atmosphere in the schools, specifically in a week where it came to light that a teacher was aware of a gun in the school and did nothing about it?
Question is about what happened at Pulaski High School, where a teacher was apparently aware of a student who had a gun but did not take any steps to address that issue. That's the best I can tell that. Let me again, I guess I'll go down to John Chisholm for a response to that.
My experience when dealing with school officials is they are a class of people that disproportionately really likes kids. They don't hate kids, believe it or not, after all the work they do with them. They really love kids, so there's built into them a resistance to prosecuting them in a lot of ways. What I think we have to do is again, have a backstop somewhere. And certainly if we have adults coming onto our school grounds and committing acts of violence, we should be taking that very, very seriously, and we should be applying the appropriate enhancers for those individuals. If you have a small group of individuals, and that's usually the case, who create a disproportionate amount of the violence, then we should hold them accountable in a way that we haven't traditionally done. It shouldn't be a citation. It should be at least a criminal review. Maybe a citation in the end is appropriate. Maybe not, but at least we should go through the full process of evaluating that person and signifying that it's really an important issue to us that you not commit crimes in a school zone, that those should be sacred ground for us. The same strategy can be applied in other areas, whether it's a mall or whether it's a park or whatever the case may be. But we should demonstrate that there's a point beyond which we will not go. And if it's a small group of individuals that want to behave in a way that ruins it for everybody else, then they should be looked at very closely, and we should take appropriate action.
Let me take a question right here.
Yeah, I'm in-house counsel for a large restaurant company, and we operate Pizza Huts and Applebee's, and we've seen the incidents of violent crime both at our restaurants and with our delivery drivers increasing pretty dramatically over the last few years. Certainly we all have seen the Jimmy John's driver who was murdered. What can I do to work with you proactively, or to come up with a proactive, comprehensive strategy to protect our employees, and what will you do to work with me and the others in the business community to come up with a comprehensive strategy to protect, for us, it's probably 300 employees within the city of Milwaukee alone.
He represents a company that employs 300 people in this area. They're concerned about the fact that some of their employees have been the victims of crime, and he's asking how can he work proactively with law enforcement to help reduce this problem. I guess, again, John Chisholm, that's probably a good place to start.
And this is a great thing about the system that we're implementing right now, is what I'd tell you is where do you work out of? What districts do you work out of? Where do your employees go where they're facing the most danger? And talk to us and tell us where they've encountered the greatest problems or the greatest risk, and then we'll work with you. We'll come up with a strategy for you. And in turn, I suspect that your drivers, your employees, can give us a lot of information as well. They can provide useful information that would help us perhaps identify one of our major violators, for example, and we'd do it in a responsible way where they wouldn't be exposed, but maybe we could take something back from it in exchange. What we would do is start an ongoing relationship where we'd talk on a regular basis. You could come to crime analysis meetings. You could express what your concerns are. We could tell you that we're concerned about your drivers making that short-term rational decision to carry a concealed weapon that could eventually lead to a long-term bad consequence. So those are fair conversations to have. But again, let's engage in a dialogue. Let's talk. Let's come up with a strategy, and let's do something.
Right up there.
Do the taxpayers spend enough on law enforcement, or
Do the taxpayers spend enough on law enforcement, or
Pick me.
should they?
Pick me, Mike.
Go ahead.
You can tell us the Attorney General's not paid enough?
More money, more money, more money. I tell you what, I travel the state and I speak to all groups of all philosophies, and if there's one message that I'm spreading, it's absolutely we do not. Government has become way too involved in way too many things and way too uninvolved in the things that they were first organized to participate in. I don't think that there is any more significant role for government, at least state government, to play than public safety. Right now in the Attorney General's office, we are funded by less than 1% of the state budget, and we are largely associated with public safety. I'm a fiscal conservative. I, by and large, believe in putting money back in the pockets of the taxpayers and cutting our overall budget. But I believe we need to reprioritize where it's spent. Typical example, we have requested in this budget a lot of positions for a lot of different initiatives. And I know from my law enforcement experience, they can have a tremendous impact on law enforcement in different categories around the state. The requests seem like they're out of this world because they're a 7% increase in my budget. They're a 0.03% increase in the state budget, or part of the state budget as a whole, and we can have a tremendous difference which would save the state far more money than they would ever invest because of the public safety that we would provide. So I would submit to you that we don't need to spend more of our taxpayers' money, but we need to spend it more wisely.
Let me ask you a real quick follow-up to that. You said you'd like to hear from Milwaukee authorities about what you can do to help here. Frankly, do you have the resources to help even if you're asked?
Do I personally have the resources within the Department of Justice? Some, but not as much as we need. But I can tell you what, if we go in with a united front, if the U.S. Attorney, well, he can't lobby, but the District Attorney, the Mayor, the Chief of Police, the Sheriff, some community leaders, and myself come to an agreement on the places where money needs to be most wisely spent, I can take that to the legislature. I can take that to the government because of the legislature and the governor because of the position I'm in, and we're in an incredibly strong position to advance the need for resources there. So we have the ability, if we speak as one voice, to get the resources we need in the most important areas.
And when we work in a task force concept, we've demonstrated that we can very effectively use the resources that are available right now. And we've been in discussions with the Attorney General's office. We've had an ongoing relationship with the U.S. Attorney's office in a task force mode to work very closely to use those resources. But with respect to the fundamental question, your fundamental question, I'd introduce you to Chris Legal. He's been in our office now for 12, 13 years. And many of you I would love to hire right out of the law school right now, but you would have to make that fundamental assessment is, can I afford to be an assistant DA? And Chris Legal is in the sensitive crimes unit right now. That's a unit that was set up to do maybe 25 felony, the most serious felony cases that we encounter, the most difficult felony cases that we encounter. And he is a prosecutor that I'd stack up with any prosecutor in the country. However, he also has to deal with over 100, a caseload of close to 100 right now because of the limitations on the number of prosecutors we've had. We've aggressively sought federal funding. 40 of our prosecutors are federally funded. The reality is we haven't had new prosecutors given to us by the state in going on 4 or 5 years. At the same time, using the example of sensitive crimes, you could look at a statute book under the sensitive crimes laws from 1998 and compare it to today, and it's doubled. So the complexity, the number, the extent of the cases has doubled, but the pay hasn't. The pay hasn't increased. So that's a tough choice. We've lost over 60 assistant DAs in the last 5 years from our office. These are experienced people, the people that are going to handle our sexual assault cases involving children many times. These are the cases that we need wisdom, we need experience, we need dedication, and you're losing that. You're losing that because people have to make tough choices. They want to care for their families, but disproportionately right now you have people that are true public servants. They're doing it because they love the job and they know that they're making a difference. But yeah, we need more money for prosecutors. You're always arguing about more cops, but you never argue about more prosecutors. I'll say unabashedly, you need more money for prosecutors, and we should come up with a more rational way of paying them than we do right now.
Steve Biskupic, you want to just weigh in very briefly on that?
What's that old commercial? You can pay me now or pay me later. I mean, what's the cost of crime to a guy with 300 jobs in Milwaukee? I mean, it's all a ripple effect. So to me, it's an allocation of resources for the law students here. Obviously, in the Constitution, most crime is supposed to be addressed at the local level, not at the federal level.
One more question, and I think then we're going to have to call it a day.
Would it make any sense to consider a pro bono prosecutor system?
Would it make any sense to consider a pro bono?
I think
a couple of candidates right there.
Yeah, that's right. We've had a great, and Dave, you know this, we've had a great program during the summer with the local law firms, and that's been a huge help to us. But they only stay for about 3 months. I'd love, even if it was on a rotating basis, to be able to have 4 or 5 young lawyers just out of law school who would yeah, young in heart lawyers who would love to work in our office. And under this new structure, it'd be an exciting time to be there because you're going to be doing whatever we do. We're taking our young attorneys right now and throwing them in with our most experienced people, and much like it's a system that you would recognize instantly. It's sort of Back to the Future, but we're asking them to step up their game right now and deal with cases under some guidance and supervision from team captains like Tom Potter and experienced folks. But it's an exciting time. But that's based on the reality that I'm not going to have the same amount of resources today in a couple weeks from now. It's going to continually go down until something dramatic happens. So yeah, I would take help from any quarter I could get it from. Thank you.
Before we go, they say timing is everything, and I would really be remiss. we do have Steve Biskupic here today, and we do have a room full of attorneys, and some of you actually read the newspaper, I know, and read the Journal-Sentinel or the New York Times today. I have to ask you, do you have any comment on that confidential meeting you had with Attorney General Gonzalez in Chicago?
Let me give advice to all young lawyers. If you're going to go into a meeting and chastise your boss, try not to talk to a reporter afterwards. And I didn't, but somebody did. I really don't have any comment other than it's an interesting time to be a U.S. attorney. I hope to continue to be a U.S. attorney, but I hope to continue to be a U.S. attorney who decides cases solely on the facts and independent of any kind of partisan judgment. And I think I've done that, but
You sound like you're running for something.
yeah, I'm looking for a job in a little bit. I think. One way or another. So anyway, I'll just say that.
I appreciate you answering that question. First of all, thanks so much to the audience for you making time for this, and thanks so much to our guests today. We appreciate it. Thanks. Enjoyed it. Yeah, enjoyed it. Thank you.